What could be worse than losing control of a massive passenger jet in one of the most densely populated cities on the planet? This is exactly what happened to the pilots of Air France Flight 11 on April 5th of this year. On the final approach to Paris-Charles de Gaulle Airport, two pilots struggle for control of their Boeing 777, while alarm remains in the cockpit and the plane rocks from side to side. How did they get into this situation? Most importantly, how would they get out of it? This is the story behind Air France Flight 11. On April 4th, 2022, at 9 p.m., Air France Flight 11 pushed back from the gate at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. The Boeing 777-300 EOR was on a 7-hour flight to Paris. On board were 177 passengers and 15 crew members. In the cockpit, there were two pilots. Nobody on the flight knew it at the time, but in a few hours, the pilots would be battling with their controls in a desperate attempt to save the lives of all 192 passengers. At 9:15 that night, Flight 11 took to the skies above New York and flew east out of the Atlantic Ocean. The 777 is a modern long-haul passenger plane. It has an excellent safety record and is still one of the most technologically advanced and fuel-efficient aircraft in the sky. Only two Boeing aircraft utilize fly-by-wire technology, a system that routes all pilot inputs to the controls through computers. Before adjusting the flight control surfaces on the wings and tailplane, this reduces the likelihood that pilots will inadvertently place the aircraft in a dangerous situation, such as an aerodynamic stall, overspeed, or an excessive bank angle. The aircraft used for this flight was 17 years old and had first entered service in 2005. The flight continued as planned over the Atlantic, and by 7:30 a.m. local time, the plane had begun its descent into Paris. The first officer, sitting in the right seat, would fly the approach and land the plane at Charles de Gaulle. He would use runway 26 left, which would require him to fly out to the east of the airport before turning 180 degrees to align with the westerly-facing runway. The skies were cloudy, and the pilots would not emerge from the bottom of the clouds until they were only 300 feet above the ground. The descent proceeded smoothly, and the aircraft aligned with the runway by 7:45 that morning. For minutes later, air traffic controllers cleared the flight to land. The crew lowered the gear and set the autopilot's airspeed to 140 knots, their approach speed. They then completed the landing checklist. Shortly after, while descending from an altitude of about 1,500 feet above ground, the first officer disconnected the autopilot and began manually locating the aircraft. He left the autothrottle engaged, allowing the autopilot to control the aircraft's speed. He made minor adjustments to the controls, steering the plane slightly left and right as necessary. The aircraft then began banking 6 degrees to the left, seemingly without warning. The first officer was taken aback by this, and the captain noticed that the aircraft was beginning to veer off the approach path. Seconds later, the bank angle had reached 7 degrees, which exceeded the normal bank angle at this point in the approach. The crew, perplexed, called for a go-round. The first officer pressed the takeoff and go-round buttons on the throttles, causing them to go round, and began pulling the plane's nose up. As the plane pitched upwards and the engine spooled, the left bank increased to 15 degrees. The aircraft seemed to have a mind of its own. Now both pilots were battling with the controls. The forces they were encountering through their control columns were so powerful that one pilot accidentally pressed the push-to-talk button, transmitting the incident to air traffic control. After becoming concerned about their transmission, the controller called the aircraft. At the same time, another Air France flight had just taken off from the runway, which was now below Flight 11. If it continued climbing, it could collide with the out-of-control aircraft above. The controller instructed this aircraft to immediately stop climbing at 1,500 feet. However, the controller had no idea whether the aircraft had heard him because the pilots of Flight 11 continued to inadvertently press the push-to-talk button while fighting with the controls. The crew then pressed the takeoff go-round switch on the throttles for the second time. This pushed the engines to their maximum power, and the aircraft accelerated into a steep climb, pitching up to 24 degrees over the horizon. The first officer issued the standard call for a positive climb and then retracted the landing gear. However, his failure to raise the flaps triggered the gear configuration warning alarm. The plane warned the pilots that it was approaching the ground and preparing to land. I didn't get why they were raising the gear. Fortunately, the pilots of the flight that had just taken off had heard the controller's instructions to stop at 1,500 feet, and when Flight 11's crew stopped transmitting, they informed him. The physical force required to counteract the pressure on the controls was more than 50 pounds, and both pilots were nearing their physical limits. They were in one of the world's most densely populated cities. If they lost control of their aircraft, it was impossible to predict how many people would die on the ground. When they reached an altitude of 4,000 feet, the captain took control of the aircraft and stabilized it. The aircraft then contacted air traffic control. The crew assessed their situation and decided that they should take a cautious second approach to shower and go. Whatever the problem was, it appeared to have resolved itself. The safest course of action was to activate the autopilot and circle back around for a second approach while closely monitoring the aircraft. The first officer resumed control of the aircraft, and the captain communicated these intentions to air traffic control. The first officers discovered that the aircraft had enough space to fit the engine and gear. So, I hope this was a great job. After about 2 years of growth, I would advise the crew to train as soon as possible. I'd recommend the engine. A short while later, the crew received instructions to align with runway 27 right, a descendant of Gaul. After a few minutes, they resumed their final approach, and as they broke through the clouds at 300 feet above the ground, they welcomed the sight of level terrain. The plane landed safely on the second attempt, and the crew returned to the terminal. Immediately, everyone was wondering what had caused a modern aircraft like the 777 to go haywire on its final approach. Was there a flaw in the computerized flight controls? Was there an issue with the plane's maintenance? Should passengers on 777s be worried? The French Bureau of Investigation and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, or BEA, launched an immediate investigation into the incident. They obtained the aircraft's cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder and began examining them for clues as to what had gone wrong. They quickly identified a potential culprit, and it was surprising how simple it turned out to be. For some reason, during the final approach, the first officer began making a series of inputs on the controls, which caused the aircraft to tilt to the left. With the aircraft in the clouds, he could only rely on his primary flight display to determine its orientation. For some reason, he did not realize he was banking the aircraft to the left, despite manipulating the controls to do so. The aircraft simply followed his commands, but he appeared to be unaware of them. When the first officer informed the captain that the aircraft was turning left, the captain assumed that there was a problem with either the weather or the aircraft, so the crew initiated a go-around. But this is where the real breakdown happened. During the go-around, the captain began flying the aircraft, but he never stated that he was taking control by issuing the standard call-out, "I have control." This meant that both pilots were now struggling with the controls simultaneously. This is the recipe for disaster. The 777 mechanically links the control columns. Look how they move in complete sync here. If one pilot uses 10 pounds of force to lower the nose, the other pilot must counteract with 10 pounds of force to keep the nose level. Two pilots should never fly the aircraft at the same time. In this case, the pilots were applying up to 50 pounds of force to the controls. During the go-around, the first officer was pulling back with all of his might against what he perceived to be a deranged aircraft intent on nose-diving into the ground. The captain, on the other hand, was pushing hard on the controls with all of his strength, attempting to bring the aircraft's nose down while it appeared to want to climb straight up. In the heat of these desperate moments in the cockpit, Each pilot was so focused on saving the aircraft that he didn't notice the other was fighting with the controls in the opposite direction. They were fighting one another, not their aircraft. This was an embarrassing, if not downright dangerous, situation. According to the BEA's initial reports, the forces on the controls were so strong that they decoupled twice. This built-in safety mechanism ensures that at least one control is always accessible by wrenching the other control column free if one becomes jammed. This means that at 2 points during the flight, the pilots applied so much force to the controls that they overcame the built-in safety mechanism, which is only present when a controller becomes jammed. In this case, both control columns were perfectly operational. It appears that the pilots were not in complete control. This is an embarrassing incident for Air France, and it is not the first time two of its pilots found themselves fighting for the controls without realizing it. They flew across the Atlantic Ocean after one pilot held the aircraft's nose up while the other attempted to push it down. In that case, the outcome was less favorable, as all 228 people on board died. The crash resulted in a renewed focus on crew resource management, both within Air France and throughout the industry. This is essentially teamwork and communication in the cockpit. But was Air France 11 another example of the left seat not understanding what the right seat was doing? Have we already forgotten the lessons from Air France 447? Perhaps it is too early to say, as the investigation is still ongoing. However, if we fail to take serious steps to address these issues, the next aircraft and its passengers might not experience the same luck. While human error is inevitable, a two-person flight crew offers the advantage of identifying and correcting errors before they escalate. This time, it appears that a breakdown in crew resource management nearly resulted in a disaster. We await the application of the lessons learned from this incident to avert future fatalities. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel YouTube. I'd like to thank Snow Doggo and Joey for their generous contributions. You can support the channel and see more videos on Patreon or YouTube. I've displayed the links here on the screen. As always, please let me know if there are any incidents you'd like me to discuss, and I'll see you next week for another episode.